The monster was eating the corpse of a deer and the flies were circling over it. It growled, covering its face from the light of my flashlight with its paw, and then stood up, straightened to its full height, almost touching the ceiling with its head, which was 3 meters high, and slowly walked toward me. Did Finn manage to survive in this situation, and what kind of monster is it? We will tell you more in the video. It was on the Kola Peninsula in 1999, not far from the Finnish border. Finn then, as part of a geological exploration group, was conducting surveys for the construction of a highway from St. Petersburg to Murmansk. It was late fall. Finn and his friends climbed into such places that it was impossible to pass. That day they stopped on the shore of Lake Tavazhervi. At that time of the year it was very wet and cold there, fog everywhere. The terrain was strewn with ravines, former trenches. It was dry enough, beautiful coniferous forest smoothly merged with birch trees. The clearing where they camped was carpeted with flowers. But Finn had not come to admire flowers and landscapes, so he got up earlier than his companions, took a compass, matches, radio, put on rubber boots, and took one simple geological equipment, a spade, and decided to look around for the future day's work. At first, Phil walked along the edge of the clearing, looking for the most convenient way through the dense interlocking branches of fir trees. And then, after climbing through the fir trees and cutting down a couple of interfering branches with his shovel, he finally entered the forest. Phil stopped and listened. He didn't want to run into a bear or other forest animals, but it was quiet, only a woodpecker tapping its beak on a tree in the distance. Then he confidently went on. After 10 minutes, the soil and grass under his feet began to squelch, and among the grass there were reeds, and soon he came to a swamp. He didn't want to go straight into the mud, so of course he decided to go around it. Phil walked along the marsh for a long time, when suddenly he came upon a barbed wire fence. The wire was rusty, the wooden posts to which the wire was fastened had rotted away, and the fence was held together by rusty iron bars interspersed with wooden posts, part of which had sunk into the swamp. It was a cemetery fence. Behind the fence, he saw graves that were almost overgrown with grass. Obviously, the cemetery had long been abandoned. He got curious, climbed over the wire, bent it aside with a trowel, and began to look around the cemetery. There were rotten wooden or mossy stone crosses everywhere, alternating with mass graves marked with shabby rusty stars. Obviously, the cemetery was from the Tsarist times, but it had been used in later times as well. The cemetery itself was gradually being swallowed up by the swamp, and my feet were slightly sucked into the eroded marshy ground. At first, he was thrilled by the excitement of such an outlandish place. He was not a stalker, but it was very interesting to suddenly stumble upon such a curious place. If I had a phone at the time, I would have taken pictures. But it was the dilapidated stone chapel in the middle of the cemetery that caught my attention. He came closer to get a closer look. The chapel was a mossy stone structure with a rusty metal door, and the windows were narrow openings cut into the wall. The panes were long since broken. He cautiously entered the chapel, but it was very dark inside, and at first he couldn't see much. The walls were completely bare. The ancient icons had long ago decayed and fallen down, now lying on the floor. But soon something seemed wrong. First, he heard a buzzing in the far corner as if a swarm of flies were swarming over the corpse. Then in the far corner of the chapel, in the semi-darkness, he saw a strange shadow leaning over something. At first I thought it was a man, but my eyes were not yet sufficiently accustomed to the darkness, so he turned on his lantern and illuminated the space in front of him with it. It was a humanoid creature, unknown to me, of enormous stature, covered in dark gray fur with a tinge of green. The monster was eating the corpse of a deer, over which flies were swirling. It growled, covering its face from the light of my lantern with its paw, and then it rose to its feet, straightened to its full height, almost touching the ceiling with its head, which was 3 meters high, and walked slowly toward me. At first he fell into a daze from the fear that gripped him, his heart racing in his chest from the adrenaline rush. But he managed to pull himself together quickly. He slammed the heavy door to the chapel shut, leaning against it with his whole body. The only way to stop the monster was to try to lock it inside. He shoved a rusty metal bar from the fence of one of the graves between the massive brackets of the door handles. Realizing that the door was locked, the monster began to pound at it from the inside with extraordinary force, trying to break it down. Realizing that the door was unlikely to hold the monster for long, he quickly rushed to the exit of the cemetery. When he returned to the camp, he told no one about what had happened. He told his colleagues about his absence, that he had gotten lost, that he was out of breath, and that he had seen the bear. Until the end of the expedition, he did not part with his rifle, but he never met the monster again. However, it was not the end of the story. 2 years later, I happened to be in the same area again. I was driving along a new highway, the area for which I was exploring during my story. I was curious to see the cemetery again. When he arrived at the site of the monster, the chapel door was half torn off its hinges and a rusty crumpled sheet hung over the entrance. There was no one inside. Only a pile of freshly charred animal bones littered the floor. Bigfoot was a suggestive and terrifying sight, his muscular body and sharp claws making the man feel defenseless. Simons prayed that Yeti wouldn't notice him, that he would leave as mysteriously as he had appeared. Yeti suddenly spotted Simons as he tried to hide in his sleeping bag. His yellow eyes stared at him, glowing fiercely in the darkness of the forest. Bigfoot let out a loud growling sound that pierced the air, causing Simons to clench in fear. The huge creature began to approach him slowly, step by step. Simons was born in a humble village in northern Canada, where he spent his days in a small house with his parents and younger brother. He inherited a love of music from his father, but due to the family's financial difficulties, he was unable to pursue a professional musical education. Nevertheless, he diligently learned to play guitar on his own, performing at local talent shows. After graduating from high school, Simons was able to find work in construction to help his family through hard times. His musical ambitions remained just a dream that seemed unattainable. Simons has been fascinated with finding coins and old artifacts since the first time he saw his friend find an ancient coin in a field near their village. Ever since then, he dreamed of finding something of value that would help his family out of financial difficulties. Every month, when he received a check for his work at the construction site, Simons would rent a metal detector for the day and go searching. He searched parks, the woods, the beach, anywhere there might be something of value. Sometimes a whole day would pass without finding anything but rusty nails and bits of metal. But one day, when he was ready to leave and return home disappointed, his metal detector buzzed. Simons was amazed and started digging, and discovered an antique copper object, which later turned out to be an ancient coin of value. He was thrilled. It was something he had always dreamed of. Simons sold the coin to a collector and earned a considerable amount of money, enough to help his parents, but not everything is like a fairy tale. And one day, he had a rough patch. Simons woke up early in the morning and, as usual, turned on the TV to watch the latest news. He sat in a comfortable chair drinking his morning coffee and listened to the anchor with interest. The news was about a family that was vacationing in the woods when they were attacked by a mysterious creature. A lockmate monster with yellow eyes, 2.5 meters tall, attacked them, taking their dog and disappearing into the woods. Simons listened to this terrible news with amazement. He imagined the horror that these people had experienced and felt a certain uneasiness. But in his heart, he felt that it was just a fiction, something like a myth or a legend. He couldn't believe that such a creature really existed, so he decided not to take it seriously. He turned off the television, going to work thinking that it was just someone's sinister joke or hoax. When Simons arrived at work, all of his coworkers couldn't stop discussing the news about the mysterious creature in the woods. They joked, speculated that it might have been a bear or wild boar, and laughed at the fact that some people actually believed it. "What stories they make up," said one of them. "We should meet such a thing," added another, and everyone laughed. Simons, too, joined in the discussion, but in the back of his mind he still felt some uneasiness. He couldn't get rid of the thought that maybe it wasn't just fiction after all. Toward the end of his shift, Simons was approached by an employee named Michael, who knew of his fascination with treasure and coin hunting. "Listen, Simons," Michael began. "I have a friend who does archaeology, and he said there's a place in our area where ancient artifacts and coins have been found. I'm thinking maybe there's something else of value hidden there. Would you be interested in checking out the place?" Simons was surprised and excited by this suggestion. He agreed and arranged for Michael to meet him after work. After work, Simons met with Michael and his friend, who was an archaeologist. They told him about a place where ancient artifacts and coins had been found and said there might be something valuable hidden there. Simons was very intrigued by the idea and agreed to check out the place. However, when he asked his friend Michael why he had not decided to check out the place himself, Michael replied that after today's news about the mysterious creature in the woods, he was afraid to visit the woods. Simons and Michael laughed at this answer, and Simons said that there was nothing to be afraid of. It was just fiction. The 2 weeks went by quickly, and finally the day came when Simons received his paycheck. He immediately decided to rent a metal detector for 2 days to go on an overnight search in the woods that Michael's friend had told him about. Simons packed his belongings: a tent, sleeping bag, food and water, and of course the metal detector. He said goodbye to his family and set off into the woods, determined to find something of value. The night in the woods was quite frightening, but Simons was able to sleep knowing that he was doing what he loved. The next morning after breakfast, he began his search in the woods. The first day went by without success, but on the second day the metal detector buzzed. Simons started digging, and in the accumulated earth he found an ancient sword. He was amazed and overjoyed, realizing that he had found something truly valuable. Simons realized that selling the sword he had found could bring him a considerable amount of money, but he also realized the value of this artifact and dreamed of having it in his collection. He decided to stay another day in the forest to continue his search and find something else of value. Simons returned to his camp and began cooking dinner over a fire. He started a fire on which he placed a pot of water for hot tea. He chopped up the vegetables and meat he had brought with him and began to prepare a delicious dinner. After dinner, he laid down in his sleeping bag, watching the stars in the night sky. Simons woke up to a mysterious growl that sounded in the quiet forest. He opened his eyes and saw the huge silhouetted body of a yeti standing by the fire in the light of the moon. The huge creature seemed motionless, as if studying the camp and everything around it. Simons shrank back, trying not to make a sound so as not to attract the yeti's attention. He watched it with horror and wonder, unable to believe his eyes. Bigfoot was huge, his woolly body shimmering in the moonlight, his yellow eyes glinting in the darkness of the forest. He paced around the camp, peering into every corner as if searching for something. Simons squirmed even tighter, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. Bigfoot was a suggestive and terrifying sight, his muscular body and sharp claws making the man feel defenseless. Simons prayed that Bigfoot wouldn't notice him, that he would leave as mysteriously as he had appeared. Bigfoot suddenly spotted Simons as he tried to hide in his sleeping bag. His yellow eyes stared back at him, glowing fiercely in the darkness of the forest. Bigfoot let out a loud snarling sound that pierced the air, making Simons clench in fear. The huge creature began to approach him slowly, step by step, its muscular paws treading heavily on the damp ground. Simons was paralyzed with fear. He felt the yeti grab his legs and begin to drag him like a toy. His heart pounded frantically in his chest as he felt the power of the yeti dragging him through the forest. Simons tried to break free, but the yeti's paws were too strong for him to break free. Simons felt a deafening blow to his head, after which he lost consciousness. When he came to, he found himself bound and in some kind of cave. Fear was still blazing in his eyes as he realized that he was being held captive by a yeti. The huge creature stood before him, its sharp claws glinting in the darkness of the cave, its yellow eyes looking at him with curiosity. Simons realized that this was the end, that he would not be able to get out of this situation. Out of panic, Simons tried to talk the yeti into letting him go, promising him something of value in exchange for his freedom. But the yeti was motionless, not understanding the man's words. Simons, sitting tied up in the cave, heard the yeti slowly backed away deep into the forest. After a while, he heard a distant noise and realized that the yeti had gone away, leaving him alone in the cave. Simons began to look around, trying to find a way out of the cave. He groped the walls and floor of the cave, looking for any way out. There was a lot of debris and old objects around, broken bottles, fragments of old tools, and bone remains of animals. He was alone in a dark cave, bound and hopelessly lost. Simons felt panic and despair as he awakened in the cave the next day. He tried to free himself, but the ropes were too tight and he only rubbed his hands and feet. He felt pain and hunger, his thoughts swirling around his family, who now had to worry about his disappearance. 3 days passed, days turned into nights. He heard animal rustles outside the cave walls and imagined terrifying scenarios. He prayed for salvation, hoping someone would find him or Bigfoot would return and it would all be over. But time passed slowly, and each day his hope for salvation dimmed more and more. He began to feel alienated from reality, with the feeling that he was forgotten in this dark cave, a prisoner of a mysterious creature. Simons stared in amazement at the Yeti, who returned with a fresh hair and freed it from the ropes. He could not believe his eyes when the beast threw the hair to him and silently left the cave. Simons sat in bewilderment, unable to believe his good fortune. He couldn't understand why the Yeti had freed him, but he was grateful for it. Showering himself with sweat, he dared to get up and run out of the cave in fear. He ran without looking back as the forest flashed around him. All his thoughts were focused on escape, on getting back to his family. He was exhausted and weary, but his fear and adrenaline kept him moving forward. Soon he ran out to the edge of the forest and saw the light that shone through the trees. It was sunshine, freedom, salvation. Simons ran out of the forest and found himself at the edge of the village. His eyes were dazzled by the bright morning sun. He felt as if he had returned to a world that had seemed so distant and terrible to him only moments before. He went to the nearest house to ask people for help. Upon reaching the house, Simons knocked on the door, and when it was opened, took the opportunity to sit down, finding himself at the edge of his strength. The owners of the house, raising their eyebrows in surprise, asked him what had happened and why he was so exhausted and frightened. Simons began to tell them his story of his encounter with Bigfoot. The owners of the house listened with interest and surprise, but did not take him seriously. After he had eaten and rested, Simons decided to go home to see his family and tell them about his incredible adventure. He thanked his hosts for their help and set off. When Simons returned home, his family was alarmed by his disappearance and they all hugged him happily. Simons told them his whole story about Bigfoot, the cave, how he had been freed, but his family didn't believe him, thinking his story was fiction or fantasy. Simons was disappointed that his story was seen as implausible, but he knew it was real. He decided to keep the incident in his memory as one of the most amazing and frightening moments of his life. Despite all the disbelief and ridicule from others, Simons knew that his encounter with Bigfoot was real and that he had experienced an incredible adventure that changed his life.